Hey there, and welcome to this deep dive. We're really tackling a book with a provocative title today.
This could be an interesting one.
It is. It's Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. And I have to admit, when I first picked this up, I thought, okay, is this just going to be like a permission slip to be a jerk? Like,
Right.
is that what we're doing here?
Yeah, the title's a bit misleading, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not really about being indifferent or just not caring about anything.
Right.
It's more about being intentional with your energy and your attention and deciding what really matters to you.
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me, I don't know if you've ever heard that quote from, I think it was Marcus Aurelius. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. And I feel like this book is kind of like a more modern
Yeah.
take on that whole Stoic philosophy.
Absolutely. And it's really refreshing because he doesn't sugarcoat anything.
Yeah.
He's very upfront about the fact that life can be messy and challenging, and sometimes things just plain suck.
And he uses a lot of like real life examples and stories to get his point across, like the one about Charles Bukowski.
Oh, yeah. The hard-living writer who found success later in life.
Yeah. And I love the irony of his tombstone, which reads, "Don't try."
It's so perfect.
Yeah.
Because in a way, it embodies that whole idea of accepting imperfection and not getting too caught up in the outcome.
So let's unpack this whole not giving a fuck thing, because I think it can be easily misinterpreted.
Dive-
It's not about being apathetic. It's about being intentional. So how do we even begin to figure out what's worth giving a fuck about?
Well, he talks a lot about values and how we need to identify what truly matters to us. Like what principles are driving our decisions. Are they healthy values that are moving us forward, or are we chasing empty pleasures or the need to always be right?
Oh, the need to be right.
That's a
Big
huge
one. Huge. And it's often disguised as something else. Like we might think we're just trying to be helpful or informative, but really we're just trying to prove that we're smarter than everyone else.
And social media has just amplified that, hasn't it? Oh, absolutely. It's like a breeding ground for validation seeking and the need to appear perfect all the time.
Which is exhausting
Yeah.
and unattainable.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to define success on our own terms instead of letting society dictate what we should be striving for.
And he talks about this idea of being in love with the result, but not the process, which really resonated with me. Have you ever found yourself like romanticizing a certain career path or goal, but then you realize like, oh, wait, there's a lot of hard work involved that I haven't really considered?
All the time. We tend to focus on the end goal, that shiny result, without really acknowledging the daily grind it takes to get there.
Right. Like everyone wants to be a rock star, but nobody wants to spend years practicing in their garage.
Exactly. And that's where a lot of people get tripped up. They fall in love with the destination, but they hate the journey.
And then they give up before they even really get started.
Yeah, and that's a shame. Because some of the most rewarding experiences in life come from pushing through those challenges and coming out the other side.
Totally. And he talks about his own experience with this too, right? Like he's very open about the fact that he's not perfect. He's made mistakes. He struggled.
Yeah, he's very relatable in that way. He doesn't shy away from his own flaws and insecurities, which makes his message even more powerful.
He talks about his feedback loop from hell. Have you ever been stuck in one of those?
Oh gosh, yeah, who hasn't? It's that feeling of being anxious about being anxious, guilty about being guilty, just constantly spiraling downwards.
And it's like the more you try to fight it, the worse it gets.
Totally. But he suggests a different approach. Instead of trying to suppress those negative emotions, he says we should reframe our relationship with them.
Oh, that's interesting. So instead of viewing them as like the enemy.
Exactly. View them as messengers. They're trying to tell us something.
So like if we're feeling anxious, maybe it's a sign that we need to set some boundaries or prioritize self-care.
Exactly. Or if you're feeling guilty, maybe it's a sign that we need to make amends with someone or change our behavior.
So it's about listening to those emotions without letting them completely take over.
Right? And then figuring out what action we need to take based on that information.
Which I think leads perfectly into his idea of choosing your struggle, because life is going to be full of challenges no matter what we do.
Oh, absolutely. It's unavoidable.
But we get to choose what we're willing to struggle for.
Exactly. And those struggles should align with our values.
Yeah.
If we're constantly struggling for things that don't truly matter to us, well, that's a recipe for unhappiness.
And he uses a really interesting example to illustrate this point. The story of his friend's brother who's conflicted about his sister's engagement.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. He basically chooses the easy path of assuming he's right instead of actually listening to his sister and trying to understand her perspective.
And it creates all this unnecessary drama and tension.
Right, because he's making it all about him and his own beliefs instead of respecting his sister's choices.
Which is something we probably all do to some extent, right?
Oh, absolutely. We all have our blind spots and our own biases.
But it's about recognizing when we're doing that and being willing to challenge our own assumptions.
Yeah, and that takes a lot of self-awareness and humility.
And I think this ties into another concept. He talks about the tyranny of exceptionalism. Like, we're constantly bombarded with images and stories of extraordinary people achieving extraordinary things.
Oh, yeah, and it's easy to feel inadequate in
Yeah.
comparison. Like, we're not good enough, smart enough, successful enough.
Exactly. And it's this constant pressure to be exceptional that can really weigh us down.
Yeah, and he argues that true freedom comes from embracing our ordinariness. Like, it's okay to be average. It's okay to not be extraordinary in every area of our lives.
Right. And that's something he seems to embody himself. I mean, he's very open about his own struggles and failures. He even tells this pretty hilarious story about getting expelled from school.
Really? What happened?
I don't want to spoil it for the listeners, but let's just say it involves marijuana and a secret compartment in a backpack.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's a good one. You'll have to read it for yourselves.
I'll add it to my list.
But I think the point is he's not afraid to be vulnerable and show his human side.
And that vulnerability is what makes him so relatable. He's not some guru on a mountaintop. He's just a regular guy who's figured out a few things along the way and is willing to share his wisdom.
And he does it with a lot of humor, too, which I appreciate.
Yeah, he's definitely not afraid to make fun of himself, which makes the book even more enjoyable to read.
Yeah, it doesn't feel preachy or condescending. It just feels like you're having a conversation with a really insightful friend.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so effective. He's not trying to force his ideas on you. He's just presenting them in a way that's thought-provoking and engaging.
So for anyone who's feeling a little lost or overwhelmed right now...
They're just stuck in a rut.
Yeah, or maybe you're just tired of trying to live up to everyone else's expectations.
This book is definitely worth checking out. It's a refreshing reminder that it's okay to not have all the answers, and that sometimes the best thing you can do is just let go and embrace the messy, beautiful chaos of life.
I love that, the messy, beautiful chaos of life. I think that's a perfect place to wrap up this first part of our deep dive.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so back to that story about getting expelled. I got to hear more about this secret compartment.
Oh, yeah, so picture this 13-year-old Manson sitting across from the principal, Mr. Price, who's convinced he's hiding something. You know how principals get...
Oh, yeah. They can sniff out trouble a mile away.
Totally. And Mr. Price, he's on a mission, rifling through Manson's locker, dumping out his backpack, checking his pockets. But he's coming up empty.
Ooh, the suspense is killing me.
Right. And just when it seems like young Manson might actually get away with it, Mr. Price's foot brushes against something in the bottom of the backpack. Turns out there's a hidden compartment sewn into the lining. And guess what's inside?
Okay, you've got to tell me.
A stash of marijuana busted.
Oh, no. That's not good.
Not good at all. We're talking expulsion, homeschooling for the rest of the year. And to really drive the point home, they shipped him off to a private Christian school.
Wow. Talk about a reality check.
Right. You'd think that would be enough to scare him straight. But it actually kind of backfired.
Really? How so?
Well, he talks about how this whole experience, along with some others, led him down this path of feeling entitled, especially in his relationships. It's like he was trying to overcompensate for his teenage insecurities.
Oh, I see. Trying to prove himself to the world.
Exactly. He even admits to becoming kind of a player, going from one casual fling to another, searching for validation in all the wrong places.
Which, as we all know, never really works in the long run.
It's a temporary fix, not a sustainable solution.
It's like trying to fill a void with external validation, which is never going to work.
Exactly. And this ties into his whole concept of shitty values. These are the beliefs that we cling to that ultimately sabotage our well-being.
So, like what? Give us some examples.
Well, he talks about things like chasing pleasure, the constant pursuit of happiness, the need to always be right, even the relentless pursuit of positivity. All these things sound good on the surface, but they can become traps if we're not careful.
Because they're based on external factors that are ultimately outside of our control.
Exactly. True happiness and fulfillment have to come from within.
And that's a hard lesson to learn, especially in today's world where we're constantly bombarded with messages that tell us we need to be more, do more, have more.
It's like this never-ending cycle of striving and dissatisfaction.
So how do we break free from that?
Well, Manson argues that we need to start by examining our values. What do we truly believe in? What's important to us? And are our actions aligned with those values?
So if one of our values is authenticity, for example, but we're constantly trying to be someone we're not, that's going to create a disconnect.
Exactly. And that disconnect is going to lead to unhappiness, no matter how successful we become by society's standards.
He uses a really interesting example to illustrate this point, the story of Dave Mustaine, the musician who was kicked out of Metallica.
Oh, yeah. And went on to form Megadeth, which became hugely successful in its own right.
But even with all that success, Mustaine still measured his worth against Metallica's fame.
He was stuck in a comparison trap, unable to fully appreciate his own accomplishments because his values were based on external validation.
So even though he had achieved incredible success on his own terms, it wasn't enough because he was still using someone else's yardstick to measure his worth.
Exactly. And that's why Manson contrasts him with Pete Best, the drummer who was famously fired from the Beatles.
Right before they became global superstars.
Exactly. Can you imagine the pressure, the weight of what could have been?
I can't even imagine. But what's fascinating is that Best was later quoted as saying that he was happier than he would have been with the Beatles.
Can you believe that?
It's amazing. It just goes to show that there's no one-size-fits-all definition of success.
And that sometimes what seems like a setback or a failure can actually be a blessing in disguise.
It all depends on your perspective and what you choose to focus on.
And speaking of perspective, Manson really encourages us to confront something that most of us try to avoid at all costs.
Let me guess, death.
Bingo. He goes pretty deep on the whole mortality thing, even drawing on the work of Ernest Becker and his concept of Immortality Projects.
Immortality Projects sounds intense. Okay, Immortality Projects, break that down for me.
So Becker argued that humans were kind of wired to grapple with our own mortality. It's this underlying anxiety that we all have. And one way we deal with it is by creating these immortality projects, things we pour ourselves into to feel like we'll leave a lasting impact on the world.
So it's like we're trying to create something that will outlive us.
Exactly. It could be anything from building a family legacy to pursuing fame and fortune to creating a work of art that will stand the test of time.
Or even just like wanting to be remembered as a good person, someone who made a difference.
Exactly. We all want to feel like our lives have meaning and purpose. And these immortality projects, they give us a sense of continuity, a way to feel like we're a part of something bigger than ourselves.
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's what drives us to create and achieve great things.
Absolutely. But it can become problematic when it's our sole motivation, when we're so focused on leaving a legacy that we forget to actually live our lives.
Right, because then it becomes less about actually making a difference and more about feeding our own egos.
Exactly. And that's where things can get a little messy.
So how do we find a balance? How do we embrace our mortality without letting it paralyze us?
Well, Manson talks about this experience he had in South Africa, standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at this vast expanse of ocean. And it was this really visceral reminder of his own insignificance. Like in that moment, he was acutely aware of his own mortality.
I can only imagine. That must have been intense.
It was. But here's the thing. Instead of being terrified by it, he found it liberating.
Really? How so?
Because it helped him put things in perspective. He realized that all the things he'd been stressing about, all the things he thought were so important, they were actually pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of things.
So it was like this weight had been lifted off his shoulders.
Exactly. And it freed him up to focus on what really mattered, to live more fully in the present moment, to not take himself so seriously.
Which I think is something we could all use a little more of in our lives.
Absolutely. Life is too short to sweat the small stuff.
Yeah.
We need to find joy in the everyday moments and embrace the messy, imperfect beauty of it all.
Beautifully said. So where does this do something principle fit into all of this?
Well, Manson argues that action is the antidote to fear and anxiety. When we're feeling stuck or lost, the best thing we can do is just take a step, any step, even if we're not sure where it's going to lead us.
It's like that old saying, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
Exactly. And sometimes that first step is the hardest. But once we take it, the momentum builds, and we start to figure things out along the way.
He even uses this principle in his own life, right? Like when he decided to quit his job and start his blog.
Yeah, he didn't have it all figured out. He just started writing.
Yeah.
And look what happened. He built a successful career doing something he loved.
It's pretty inspiring when you think about it.
It is. And it just goes to show that we all have the power to create the lives we want, even if it's messy and imperfect and nothing like we planned.
We just have to be willing to take that first step.
Exactly. And to keep putting one foot in front of the other, even when things get tough.
And to not be afraid to ask for help along the way.
Yes. We don't have to do it all alone.
This has been amazing. But before we wrap things up, there's one more story from the book that I have to ask you about, the story of Erin.
Oh boy, Aaron. The woman who was convinced she could cure death.
That's the one. Okay.
Listen.
For those who haven't read the book, give us the rundown.
So Manson's at this sushi restaurant.
Right.
Right. And in walks Erin, a woman he met years ago and has been actively trying to avoid ever since.
Because she believes they're destined to save the world together.
Exactly. She's convinced that they are meant to cure death. And for some reason, she believes that this can only happen if they become a couple.
And she's completely serious about this.
100% serious. She's been bombarding him with emails for years, even threatening suicide if he doesn't reciprocate her feelings.
Wow, that takes Immortality Project to a whole other level.
Right. And the irony is that she's a self-improvement junkie. She's read all the books, attended all the seminars, visualized her goals, taken all the action.
But as Manson points out, she's latched onto some pretty shitty values along the way.
Exactly. Her values are so distorted that all that self-improvement work is misdirected. It's a cautionary tale about the importance of choosing our values wisely.
Because our values are our compass. They guide our decisions and shape our lives. If our values are flawed, no amount of effort or good intentions will lead us to true fulfillment.
Which brings us back to the heart of Manson's message, doesn't it? The subtle art of not giving a fuck isn't about apathy or indifference. It's about deciding what truly matters and focusing your energy there.
It's about being intentional with your time, your attention, your life.
Exactly. It's about defining your own values, setting healthy boundaries, and accepting that you can't control everything.
It's about embracing the messy reality of life with all its challenges and imperfections.
And it's about finding freedom in the mundane, in those everyday moments that make up the tapestry of our lives.
I love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a fuck, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
That life is short, and it's up to each of us to decide what will make it mean. We have the power to choose our values, our struggles, and our responses to the challenges that inevitably come our way.
We have agency. Even in the face of uncertainty and adversity, we have the power to choose our path.
Exactly. And by embracing our limitations, confronting our fears, and choosing our fucks wisely, we can create a life that feels both meaningful and fulfilling.
So to our listeners out there, what will you choose to give a fuck about?